Hello, my name is Jonathan Weiss, and I'm going to start my video blog by talking about the self publishing process and how I became a self published author. And I'm going to give you tips on how you can also self publish. This is the first in a series of video blogs I'll be doing on a number of topics. And let me begin by introducing myself. As I said, my name is Jonathan Weiss. I've got 40 years in telecommunications working for Bell Laboratories and its parent companies, where I was involved in many projects associated with wireless communications and, in particular, cybersecurity. After my retirement, I moved on to become an instructor for colleges and universities. So I taught cybersecurity for University of Toronto and for Columbia University through 2UEDX. Following that, I did freelance technical writing and I developed some high school cybersecurity text materials that have recently been published by eDynamic Learning. Something I've been doing for about 20 years now is I've been instructing in martial arts, teaching children karate. I hold a third degree black belt in Kimura Shukukai, and I was lightweight veterans kumite runner up in the 2018 Kimura Shukukai International World Tournament held in Stockholm, Sweden. So this is kind of the background that motivates my writing and informs my writing, and a little bit about who I am. Let's talk a little bit about the self-publishing process. There are a couple of things that you need to do if you wish to self-publish. Steve Martin used to say, if you want to be a millionaire and never get taxes, step one is to get $1 million. Well, similarly, before you can self-publish, you have to have something to publish. So you have to have a story to tell. So we'll talk a little bit about telling your story. And then we'll talk about once you've got a manuscript, that's kind of the easy part. The hard part comes in polishing that manuscript and making it ready for publication. And that gets into different phases of editing that manuscript. When you develop your manuscript, you may use a range of tools. And I'm going to talk about some of the tools that you can use. And then we'll talk about artificial intelligence. This is a very hot topic in the publishing industry. Obviously, in the industry, they're concerned about artificial intelligence taking away work and from legitimate human actors, and also for essentially sanitizing the writing process. So we'll talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and where it fits and where it doesn't fit. We'll talk about getting reviewers. How do you get somebody to read your stuff? And especially since you're likely to go through several drafts of it. You've got to have readers who are willing to essentially grow with you as you develop your story. And we'll talk a little bit about how to get them. We'll talk about the difference between going a traditional route for publishing versus publishing yourself. Whether to be a sponsored author with a publishing company or whether to be an indie, as I chose to do, and I'll talk about that. Some might wonder what it costs to self-publish. What I'll do is I'll talk about the different costs that might be involved in self-publishing and which ones can be avoided and which ones can't. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the different options there, depending on whether you want to pay for different services or not pay for them. Finally, we'll talk about how you distribute your book or whatever publication you're producing. We'll talk about building an author website. And finally, we'll talk about how you monitor or how you market your work. So we'll talk about all of those things. So let's begin. Let's talk about telling your story. So there are a couple of key rules when you're writing that are worth observing. There are more than these, but I thought I'd capture some of the main ones. And one of the main ones I think is important is write what you know. And I introduced myself a little bit earlier. So you can see some of the categories that I write in and some of the things that I know. And when you're writing fiction, as I did, you have to figure out how to take those things and weave a story around them. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Another key rule to writing is show, don't tell. As you write your story, you want to engage your reader and you want them to feel your story tangibly rather than tell them things, rather than describe what's going on. So use of dialogue and use of scene-based storytelling is very important. Another thing that's very important is your character needs to develop over time. Your character needs to go through some change. They say that every story you tell is about change. And as you develop your characters, you have to make sure that those characters are going through some evolution. Certainly your main characters are going through some evolution. Another piece of great advice I got when I was publishing is you want the tension to build throughout the story. So, it's great to have a setup in the beginning, the middle that tells the story, and then the end that represents the climax of the story. But even before the climax, you want to build that tension so that your readers keep on reading. Another thing that needs to be considered when you tell your story is point of view. Are you going to tell the story in the first person? Are you going to tell it from the perspective of the main character? Are you going to tell it from a third person point of view, somebody who's observing what's happening and relating it? So we'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing is, no matter where your story is set, whether it's in the real world or a world you create, you have to be able to make that world real to your readers. So that's the notion of world building, essentially making the place or the setting of the story a real place. Now, a lot of people write in science fiction and they essentially are creating brand new worlds. If you do what I did and write about something that takes place essentially in our world, you still need to be descriptive about the environment that the story is operating in and the characters are the world that the characters live in. So what I chose to write about, I travel a lot. I've taken a lot of cruises. I've competed all over the world in martial arts. I decided to write about a travel story. And what I did was I took a bunch of my different travel adventures and misadventures, and I crafted a story about a gentleman named Josh Cohen, a young man who's encouraged by his father to go outside of his comfort zone. And that pushes him to take a cruise on a cruise ship. And when he cruises on that cruise ship, he meets colorful characters. In particular, he meets 4 women who have ties to organized crime. Their fathers are engaged in organized crime. And Josh is encouraged by his father to make good mistakes, but not to make any mistakes that can't be undone. So Josh is balancing engaging with these women on the cruise with his father's charge to make good versus bad mistakes. And there are a number of adventures that result from that. All right, so here's a little bit of a fun quiz about my story, what's true and what's false. And the first fact that I'll put in here from the story, or the first item from the story, is the main character, Josh, a repressed engineer on a cruise, was based on me. Is this true or is this false? The answer is it's true and false. He's a combination of me and my son. My son works very hard. He's very bright. I encouraged him to go out and make some good mistakes. So Josh is essentially a surrogate for my son, and he is encouraged to make good mistakes in the story. There's a secondary character in the story named Jeff, who is one of Josh's travel companions. And Jeff keeps his own counsel, but he has a hidden talent that helps Josh through his adventures and misadventures with the organized crime women on the cruise. And is Jeff based on me? Well, yes and no. Once again, Jeff is a combination of myself and my son. And Jeff's talent is one that we both share, is based on an interest that we both share. If you read my biography, you might speculate on what those things are. If you read my introduction, you might speculate on what that talent is. Okay, next fact, I took a cruise and met mob women. Is this true or false? Sounds unlikely. Yes, I did meet mob women on a cruise. I also met my wife on a later cruise, but my wife is the daughter of an engineer and not a mobster. So I have to say this is both true and false so that nobody confuses the fact that my wife is engaged in organized crime. But the truth of the matter is I did meet some mob women on a cruise, and that was one of the travel misadventures that went into my story. I voiced my suspicions about the mob women to a travel companion who promptly outed them. That's something that happens in the book. This is actually true. It was a jaw-dropping moment when it occurred in reality, and hopefully you'll see that it's a jaw-dropping moment in the book as well. There's a scene where a Mexican drug dealer prepares to fight the travelers. This is something that actually happened to me. It didn't happen in Mexico, but it happened in Berlin. So this is a real incident that I've fictionalized for this book. Okay, in another scene, Josh carries a violin case, the uncertain contents of which serve to protect him. Mobsters were famous for carrying machine guns in a violin case. There's a scene where Josh is carrying a violin case and it protects him. Did this really happen? Yeah, it really happened. My daughter left a violin case on a school bus, and I had to retrieve it in a bus lot after dark. And it is the only thing that got me out of that bus lot with the unsavory characters that were there. So this is also a scene that's based on reality. Next question. In one of the scenes from the book, militant reggae becomes a valued souvenir from Jamaica. This actually happened, and the reggae is a song by John Mouse called Kill Them All, from an album called Wicked in a Bed. And you can go to YouTube and look this up, and you'll hear a very nice reggae song that has very dark themes. But the rest of that album is a very good album, and I recommend it. All right, a couple of other scenes. Near-death undertow. A scuba instructor that abandons his students during a dive lesson, a cab driver that takes hostages, a dolphin encounter, and 2 massages that go wrong, and various cruise games and the misadventures associated with them. All of these are scenes that happen in the book, and all are based on real events. And finally, there's an arrest in the book for smuggling. Did this really happen? No, but it makes for a very good climax and resolution in the book, and you'll see that. Okay. In addition to Capo Cruise Lines, I've got a number of other projects that are based on my life, writing what I know. One of them was a 9-day bike ride that was essentially a transformative trip that helped me escape from imposter syndrome at work and really changed the course of my life and my professional career. That's called Vision Quest on Spoked Wheels. As a martial arts instructor, I've been teaching students for roughly 2 decades. And the advantage to being a martial arts teacher is you don't have these students for just a school year or a semester. You have them for a good portion of their lives. And I give several case studies on those students, and I group them into 3 categories. Challengers who went on to achieve competition greatness, the challenging, the ones who present obstacles to teaching them, and the challenged, who have obstacles that are not of their own making, whether they be disabilities, etc. So I do 10 case studies of those different categories of students, total of 10 case stories, and those are captured in my novella, The Longest Lessons. I also have 3 short stories you'll see here. One is based on a first karate lesson. One is based on a woman who professes to be a witch that causes various summer campers to fall ill. And the story asks the question of whether she's really a witch or a bully or a psychological terrorist or something else. So that story is a good story to read. And finally, there's a story about a mysterious toy that keeps returning as a prank under a woman's pillow long after the prankster has gone. So those are my short stories, all things that I know about, all based on real life. All right, once you've got your story, though, you have to worry about making it something polished that people want to read. And there are various phases of editing your story that you need to go through. The first is called a developmental edit. That's when somebody looks at the story and looks at the major points of it. Does it hang together properly? Does it build tension? Does it provide character arcs? Is the plot feasible and plausible? That's the developmental edit, a big picture edit that looks at your story and the elements of your story and gives you feedback on that. Then comes the line edit. Have you said things in the best possible way in telling your story? Are you concise? Are you descriptive? Is there some way to say it better or more succinctly? The line edit looks at your story line by line and makes sure that it's communicating clearly and in the best and most succinct manner. That's a line edit. Copy edit looks over your writing for spelling, grammar, punctuation, style, etc. And proofreading is the final read before you publish to make sure that no mistakes have escaped these other editing processes. And so that's the timeline for editing. But in terms of the intelligence required for these different steps, the lowest level intelligence is associated with copy edit and proofreading. Microsoft Word provides something called Microsoft Word Editor that will read for spelling and grammar and punctuation and style and all that good stuff. So, there are tools that do this, Grammarly, etc. Developmental editing is the next level. Something can tell you whether there are inconsistencies in your story, whether the plot makes sense, whether the characters grow appropriately. There are likewise tools that do these things for you, and they're the next level of intelligence. Line edit, can something be said better or more succinctly? That's certainly another level of editing. Have you said things in the best possible way? Are there better ways that you could have written things in your story? And finally, the highest level of value, intelligence and value, is the creative part, which is writing the story. Now, it's important to know this hierarchy here, because as you consider using tools, artificial intelligence tools, those tools in terms of sophistication will start at the bottom and work their way up. And from an ethical perspective, an author needs to consider what they're willing to live with ethically in terms of relying on tools to do these things, rather than relying on human intelligence. If you use a tool for copy editing and proofreading, you're taking that work away from a human who does that for a living. Likewise, developmental editing, likewise, line editing. When you use artificial intelligence for writing, you're essentially taking away your own job. So, as a writer, we want to stay on this value chain. And from an ethical point of view, you need to consider who you're replacing when you rely on artificial intelligence for these different things. Now, obviously, there's a trade-off there, because if you do rely on human intelligence to provide these functions, you generally have to pay them. Whereas artificial intelligence might do some of these functions for less or for free. So, you want your creative voice heard, you want an economical path to getting there. You may consider artificial intelligence for some of these steps, but you have to balance that against the ethical considerations of, who would be benefiting were you not using these artificial intelligence tools. Okay, so here's a bit of a Consumer Reports matrix of the various tools. If we look at MS Word Editor, it will do the writing, the developmental editing. It does some minimal line editing, and it does copy editing, and it will not provide a beta read for you. So, here is MS Word Editor. We have Microsoft Copilot. It will do these various things for you. It doesn't do an explicit beta read right now. Similarly, Google Gemini, and ChatGPT. Copilot, Gemini, and ChatGPT are all a common class of tools that will do these different editing functions for you. ChatGPT will also provide a beta read. ChatGPT will provide that for fee. So, you'd have to pay for that with ChatGPT. Grammarly does some of these things. It does free copy editing. It will also do some line editing for clarity and tone. And if you pay for that, it will do that as well. ProWriting Plus provides a free copy editing, proofreading type of function. And if you pay for these different functions, it'll also do some degree of line editing, developmental editing. And it provides a beta reader, an AI beta reader, that will read your manuscript and give you user or reader type of feedback. AutoCrit is another tool, similar to ProWriting. It does less copy editing. I really should have left that out of AutoCrit. That's not its purpose, to correct your grammar or spelling or copy. But it will do line editing, developmental editing, and it also provides a beta read function. Once again, that's for fee. So you see the dollar signs here. Those are the ones that you generally have to pay for to get this full range of services. We go to the next slide. There we go. All right, so when you use artificial intelligence, if you're going the traditional publishing route, you generally want to avoid using it for big line edits and for writing. You might use it for some of these lower level, lower value things. But generally speaking, if a traditional publisher finds out that you're using artificial intelligence, depending on the publisher, they may disqualify you from going the traditional publishing route. So that's just something to consider. And certainly if you're using artificial intelligence to write your story for you, that's really a big deal. So I'm going to give examples of how artificial intelligence would work in each of these functions. And I'm going to use a story from a friend of mine who purposely wrote a story about a grandfather. And here it is. Here's the story. He wrote the story. That was the original story. I'm not going to go into detail on the story. But then we ran the story through a prompt. We said, copy edit the story and fix any spelling, grammar, or style mistakes. And here you can see it took his story and it corrected or did some corrections that we've highlighted in bold here. You can see it's done some limited corrections here to improve the clarity of what was written there and correct any punctuation and grammar, etc. mistakes. We then fed the story through Microsoft Copilot and said, make a slide that critiques this story. So this was essentially a high-level developmental edit. It told what the strengths of the story were. It told areas where there were areas for improvement, and it made some suggestions on making the story more engaging. So that's essentially how AI would be used for a developmental edit. Here, in addition to fixing any mistakes, we were asking our AI to add additional feeling and emotion. So this was essentially a line edit. And you can see that it made a lot of changes highlighted here in bold to the story to make the story more impactful. Never stopped loving him. There's a more powerful phrase that it added, etc. So AI can do these kinds of small line edits. And then, here we said take that story and rewrite it completely, making it more emotionally powerful and compelling. And AI rewrote the whole story. And one can read your original story and read your rewritten story, and you can decide which one you think is better. I think some of the emotion is lost in the AI rewrite, and that's why you need to be careful about using AI, is because it doesn't replace your creativity and your emotion. So once again, as you go through this timeline, you may want to be more selective at each phase on how you use AI, both from a quality point of view, from an ethics point of view, and from a publishability point of view. Okay. So here we also asked it to make the story into a poem. And it turned the story into a poem. The poem is actually fairly good. AI made it a poem. But, this is not something that one would choose to publish, for ethical reasons, because it's written by a machine. It's not written by a person. So that, you can engage AI to do writing. It wrote a very specific poem here based on the original story. And here we asked AI to build your own emotional short story about a grandfather, and it wrote a totally different story about a grandfather. Once again, something that wouldn't be published because it isn't written by a human. But AI can do all these things, and there are authors who are publishing strictly AI stuff. And those authors, have to deal with their ethics and resolve that ethically themselves. But it's not something that I recommend. Okay, developmental edit. I wanted to show some of the paid tools. Here was an analysis done by ProWriting Aid Plus. It looked at it and gave some critique of the story. Here's a similar critique done by AutoCrit. This is actually the virtual beta reader in AutoCrit. So it did a virtual beta read or alpha or beta read to review the story and give feedback on the story. And this is only an excerpt of that feedback.